We're going to add in the animations that we created into our Unity project. When we're in Unity, we want to click on our player. We want to come up to our window, come down to animation, and when our animator opens, you're going to see that we have our entry of our game, and we have our idle being our very first animation that it's going to go to. So when the game starts, we go directly to idle. You can change it to any of these other animations by right-clicking and set as layer default state. In this type of game, we want it to go to idle first. We're going to come over to our parameters here, and we're going to click on the plus, and we're going to add a float to start with, and we're going to call this one speed. We'll use this for our walk that is going to reference our speed that we're going to use. We're going to add a second float. We're going to call this V speed, and we're going to use this for our jump. And then we're going to add a bool. Again, the bool is a yes or no statement, or true or false, and we're going to call this ground. So with these three parameters that we've got going on here, we can now make some transitions. We're going to start with idle, right-click Make Transition, and drag to walk. Click on that transition. Uncheck Has Exit Time. Come down to the plus. And in this case, we're going to stay with speed, greater than, and I'm typing 0.01. And there's our first animation transition. I'm going to right-click on Walk, Make Transition, drag to idle. Click on this transition right here, uncheck Has Exit, click the plus, speed less than 0.01. So now, if our speed is faster than 0.01, we'll start our walking animation. If it's less than, we'll go back to idle. We're going to add in our jump for this one, and we need to click on jump first. We need to come and click on this first parameter here, and grab this drop down and change it to V speed. So it should look just like this. We're going to tell it to use this multiplier. And then we want to be able to jump from any state, whether we're idling or walking. So I'm going to right click on any state, make transition, and drag that right to jump. Click on the transition, make sure Has Exit Time is unchecked, click the plus, and we're going to choose ground and change that to false. And then we're going to right click on jump, make transition, go to idle, click on that transition, uncheck Has Exit Time, click the plus, choose ground. In this case, we want to return to idle when ground is true. So if we press the space bar and we jump, that animation, as long as we're not touching ground, we'll do the animation. But as soon as we're touching ground, we'll return to idle. So what does our coding look like for something like this? Well, we're going to come back into Visual Studio, go back up to the top, and we're going to add a couple things in. First, we have to reference that animator. So animator, and in future parts of this game, we're going to call it anim, semicolon. We've got our jump force already in there. We're going to come down to our RB2D right here, and we're going to tell it to anim equal get component angled brackets animator, and go to the end of that, parentheses and semicolon. So we're telling it to use the animator from the time we start. I want to come into our void fix update, and under RB2D I want to type in anim dot set float, because we're going to use speed first. So using our float, we want to reference that animation, parentheses, quotations. This is going to talk about our float that we put in called speed. Go to the outside of that, put a comma in. We're going to type in math function, math function, and we're going to say absolute value of our move. And come all the way to the end. So this is telling us, once again, using our float called speed, we're going to use the animator when we have a function that's our absolute of move. And then we're also going to come down and tell it to use our animator when we use our set float, parentheses v speed, comma, rb2d dot velocity dot Y, go out to the side of that. So we're going to use our V speed float when our Y has a velocity. So use that animation of our jump animation in that case. So let's go ahead and save this. And then we're going to stop it once we've got it. Coming back into our scene, let's click play. Move back and forth. So I might jump working, but I don't. And there's doing our jump animation. So we see that it's doing our jump animation, but it is not doing the walk animation. So we see that it's not all working. And we're going to get that to fix in the next step as we add in a ground check and tell it to identify what is our ground. So coming into this next step, starting working with our ground, we're going to tell it to identify a couple things for us. The first thing I need to do in my scripting is to talk about what my ground is. So I'm going to tell it to do the bool and grounded equals false. Remember, we created that bool back when we did our animator here. So now we're actually going to reference it here in our script. And I want to use that bool when I'm using my public transform of what an object I'm going to create here, and it's going to be my ground check object. And then I want to use a float on that ground check. And this float is going to be equal to a 0.2 float. And I want the radius. I'm going to add a circle collider, and it's going to have a radius of 0.2. And then the last thing is I'm going to create a layer, but I'm going to ask what that layer is. Public layer mask, what is ground? And we're going to identify what our ground is. So using those terms, we're going to come down into our script right after anim set float in our fixed update. And I'm going to hit enter. And we're going to type in grounded equals physics 2D, because that's what we're going to use, dot overlap circle. And the information we're going to use for that overlapping circle is our ground check. Dot position, comma, we're going to use our ground radius, and we're going to use what is ground, and go outside of that and add our semicolon. And then we need to talk about our animator that we set that as a parameter. So anim dot set bool parentheses quotations, and here's where we're going to tell it what bool we set and reference our variable that we are using. So anim dot set bool ground comma grounded. And we have one more set that we're going to add in here. And right now you saw that we can do this endless jumping, but we want to limit that, and we're going to limit it so that we can have what's called a double jump. So you can jump twice, but once you jump twice, you have to return to the ground before you can jump in again. So in this one, I'm going to type if parentheses, we are not, that's what an exclamation point means, not grounded equals true, parentheses, we want to return. That's as simple as that, and that will get rid of that multiple jumps that we're going to do. We still have a couple things we need to do, so we're going to come down to private void update, and we have our if input, and right before this input, we're going to talk about using our grounded. So if we're grounded and we press the space bar, we want it to reference that anim.setBool, parentheses, quotations, ground, ground, go outside of that, comma, will be false. And go outside of that, and semicolon. So if we are grounded and we press the space bar, we can go ahead and jump because our ground will be false. And using that jump force that we added in. So our scripting is done for our player at this time to get him to jump, to get him to flip, and to get the animations to work with his walk. So coming back into the game, we have a couple things we have to do once we're in our game. Delete. And what we're going to do here is we're going to come up to create, and we're going to create an empty. And this empty, we're going to click on that and call it ground check. So I'm going to come into my scene, and you can see that ground check is right there, but I'm going to make it a child of my player. And then I'm going to reset the transform of that. So I'm going to zoom in really close so we can see what happens here. So you can see this little bitty circle right here. I'm going to add a circle collider to this. Circle collider 2D. And there's my circle collider. I'm going to change my radius to a 0.1. Look how little that is. Then I'm going to take my Y position on my ground check and I'm going to move it down to his feet. This is that ground check we've been referencing in our script, and it's going to check to see if that radius is hitting that ground. The other thing I need to do is I need to go through and I need to set all of the grounds for each of my objects.